if we're going to compete in an industry as competitive as coffee, where you can now get a good cup of coffee almost anywhere, grocery stores, gas stations, coffee shops, yada, 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 we're going to have to do something more than just have good product. In order for us to survive, in order for us to be able to differentiate and ultimately be successful in scale, it had to come through culture.
Welcome to Leading in an Experience Economy, hosted by Aarthi Murali. In this show, M&T's Chief Customer Experience Officer talks with leaders inside and outside the bank who are obsessed with employees, customers, communities, and creating experiences they love. On today's show, Aarthi's joined by Nick Bayer of Saxbys Coffee.
I am super excited to talk to Nick Bayer today, founder and CEO of Saxbys Coffee, and really get into the tremendous impact that Nick is making on employees, customers, and communities, and everywhere that Saxbys is operating and beyond. Since 2005, Nick has grown Saxbys from a corner cafe in Philadelphia to nearly 30 units and over 500 colleagues. One of the many things that I find incredibly impressive about Nick is the deep social impact that he has created to establish the nation's first entirely student-run cafe in a partnership with Drexel University students, and how they become entrepreneurs while also earning full academic credits and wages. There's a lot more to Nick that I'd love to let Nick talk more about and really help us understand what's happening here, both in terms of our current environment, our communities, and more importantly, the human connections that Nick is forging along the way. Nick, thank you so much, and thanks for agreeing to speak with us today.
It's my pleasure, Aarthi. Thank you so much for having me.
Both in this together for this amazing next 30 minutes here. So let's start with, do you have a favorite coffee beverage of choice?
Yep, oh, absolutely. My favorite product is actually something that we call the Cure. The Cure is a shot of espresso or 2 shots of espresso, depending on the size or how much caffeine you really want, over ice, and then topped off with coconut water. And so, not coconut milk, but coconut water. So one, you have to like coconut water. But two, it's a very, very interesting drink because espresso is generally a little bit bitter. Mm-hmm. Coconut water is somewhat sweet. But you put them together, they actually both balance each other out, and it is super refreshing. So you're getting both caffeinated and you're getting hydrated sort of all at the same time. So the Cure, which is actually a quote unquote secret menu item at all Saxbys locations, is my favorite drink, my go-to.
Wow, that's fantastic. I'm going to have to try it. I am a coffee aficionado unofficially and very novice, I might say, but I do love my cup of coffee. I'll definitely have to give that a try. How did you, Nick, kind of going back in time, where did you find your purpose and why did you decide to embark on Saxbys? And was that really your vision of where you wanted to go?
Yeah, I think like any entrepreneur, any business leader, any individual, when we talk about sort of our professional pursuits, I think that everything is like a constant evolution, so like the Saxbys that we are today in 2021 is probably quite a bit different than the Saxbys that we were in 2019, because obviously there's a pandemic in between the two times, but it's very, very different than the company that I started well over 12 years ago. I once read a quote by a gentleman that I'm actually fortunate to be on the board of the Franklin Institute with. He was once interviewed in the Wall Street Journal, and he had this quote that has it rocked my world. That made so much sense. And he said, "The scars of our childhood should become the passions of our adulthood." And I think that for me and probably most people, it's the scars of our childhood that hopefully have become the passions of our adulthood. And that's exactly what Saxbys is. Saxbys, to those like sort of in the public, see us as a coffee and or a hospitality business. But for those that really know us, when they pull back the curtain and study why we exist and why we do what we do, they realize that we're actually, like you said at the outset of this, we're really a social impact company. We're now a certified B Corp, mm-hmm. and we're really focused on education and opportunity. Because in this country, if you don't get your education, the likelihood of you getting the opportunity to do what you love to do is few and far between. And so I believe that businesses, we can't just leave it to our grade schools, our middle schools, our secondary and colleges to quote unquote educate people. I believe that in order to educate human beings for the modern economy, the modern workforce, businesses have to have a seat at that table as well. And so, as someone who was born to teenage parents who got no education, I'm the first generation in my family to be able to go to and graduate college. My parents took whatever jobs they could get when they found out as teenagers they were about to become parents. Mm-hmm. And so you could probably guess they have never pursued what they truly love to do, what they're truly good at, because they didn't get their education. They never had that opportunity. And so they really impressed upon me to get my education, to have the opportunity to do what I love to do. What is it that I love to do? I love to impact other human beings. We have a for-profit business, but we're successful when we're doing things for others, not just our team members, but our communities and our guests alike.
Those are really powerful reflections, Nick, and thank you for the candid sharing of your personal experiences. Oftentimes we hear those two being in conflict. Can you do the right thing for your customers and communities and still remain profitable and still operate as a business and continue to thrive and offer all those benefits that you want to for your communities that you're operating in? And I share that as a reflection in context of, colleagues of mine who are in the customer experience practice, let's say. There is a constant tension in most organizations where, where do you make those investments? How do you make sure those investments are the right ones for both the growth of the organization and right for the customers and communities? And I think that's where you're going with elaborating on that. So maybe we pull on that thread a little bit more. What would you maybe share or reflect on some qualities or learnings that you had along the way that helped you strengthen not just Saxbys, but you personally as well?
I knew nothing about anything when I started Saxbys, so I think that, as I like to say, I've been in the space of higher ed as an executive in residence, an entrepreneur in residence, an adjunct professor at a bunch of different places because I love to share my story. And my story is mostly do as I say, not as I did. I didn't write a business plan before I started Saxbys. I didn't have capitalization. It is laughable how many things I did wrong in starting my business. And I think one of the most important things that happened to me is I became the first entrepreneur in residence at Cornell's School of Hotel Administration, where they started to teach entrepreneurship. And they say the best way to learn is to teach. And I am like the perfect example of that. I was brought up there to teach. I don't think I taught anything for the first several years, but I learned a lot. And one of the things that I learned, this is going to sound really naive and ignorant, but I'm comfortable enough in my failures to admit this to you and to the listeners, that we had no defined mission statement at Saxbys. We had no defined core values at that time. I was 5 years into operating my business. Now, if you would have spoken to me, if you would have spoken to the people that worked in the business, you'd hear a passion for what we believed in. But there was no organization of that. There was no training upon that. It was just sort of like a word of mouth thing. And the professors at Cornell were kind to me and started to give me books and said, "Hey, Nick, we do research on this kind of stuff." I don't know if you've heard, but the most successful businesses over long periods of time are very mission oriented and have built cultures around those things. And so I think that the biggest and maybe the most brave thing we did is we stopped the wheels on the bus as the business was building, wrote a mission statement, which is make life better. And we wrote 6 core values. And we were a franchise business at the time. So I had to go around to franchisees. People would have invested money into this brand of Saxbys to build their own business and say, "Hey guys, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. This is what we believe in." And fortunately, the great majority of them said yes. And some were like, "That's cute, Nick, but I'm actually in the business of making money." And so I had to come back to them for a second meeting and say, "Here's a check. We're going to buy your franchise. And this is now going to be a corporate business, because if we're going to compete in an industry as competitive as coffee, where you can now get a good cup of coffee almost anywhere, grocery stores, gas stations, coffee shops, yada, 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 we're going to have to do something more than just have good product." And my desire to come into the coffee business was never about having the best cup of coffee, because guess what? The best cup of coffee doesn't exist. In order for us to survive, in order for us to be able to differentiate and then ultimately be successful and scale, it had to come through culture. And so, once we committed to writing our mission statement, our core values, it was a very collaborative effort as a company. I had a friend who was a consultant. He was sort of like a culture building consultant, if you will. And he sort of led this exercise for us. And I remember him giving me two very, very critical words of advice. And he's like, Nick, Saxbys' direction, either up or down, will move in a direct correlation to your ability to follow these two rules. The first is, if you don't walk the walk 24/7, 365 about your mission core values, nobody else will. And they'll just be words on a piece of paper, meaning you are the founder, you are the CEO, but that goes for anybody. If you're the manager of a call center, you're looked at as the leader. You're looked at as the boss. They may not know Aarthi, they may not know Ira, they may not know other people. They're going to look to you as the leader. But in this particular instance, the founder, CEO of the business, if you don't walk the walk, nobody else will. The second thing is, and this is arguably even harder, is really good companies make the easy layup decisions and quote their core values. Oh, we made this decision because our mission statement is to make life better. Well, what do you do when you have a business development opportunity? You could potentially go into business with someone, but they don't have a good track record. They don't have a good reputation. They had this legal issue. They had that legal issue, but man, they're so smart. Man, they're so talented. Man, they have such a good book of business. What if you have to potentially terminate a team member, but they are a top performer? They're terrible to work with. They've done X, Y, and Z, but man, they're a top performer. The truly great companies consult and use their mission core values to make not just the easy, but the hardest decisions as well. And so those were like the two big lessons learned. And I'm really proud that 10 years later, I believe that we do those two things exceptionally well. And that's the reason, arguably the most important reason, why we've not only been able to survive, but we've been able to thrive in such a competitive industry as we're in.
And that is so relevant right now. So not just to survive, but to thrive in this environment. There was so much packed in there, Nick. I wrote down so many notes about both your reflections and your lessons learned. There's one thing I want to pull on there. Can you talk a little bit about why were you not afraid of failure? So you went back and you had some lessons learned. You learned a few things and you built and you got up and moved on. And I asked that because I've received many questions about how do we talk about failures, or how do we talk about missteps? How do we not crumble under the weight of that, but rather pick up and move on? So what is your guidance to some of those questions?
Yeah, I think, fortunately, I've got a lot of experience in failure. If you want to start a business from scratch in such a fast moving industry, particularly one that's dominated by a company as big as the Siren based business in Seattle, you got to try things. You really have to be able to try things. And I think something that has helped me significantly, not just as the CEO of our business, but just in network building, is that I speak super candidly about it. I don't act like I make all the right decisions or I have all the right answers. So I think one, it's to come across as authentic and genuine and how you admit to things. But second is to sort of tie the lesson to it as well. Like, what did you learn? Like, it's one thing to make a lot of mistakes. And if you just hammer that all the time, people are like, maybe you're just not talented or smart or capable. Like, put those two things together. Like, what did you try? Why did you try to do it? What made it fall apart? But what lesson did you learn? Our greatest failure, if you will, franchising, like we had enough success to do to move the business forward, but it was not going to bring us to the promised land. It was not going to be our dent in the universe. It wasn't going to be our moonshot. Ultimately, by unpackaging what kept it from working so well, led to the idea of experiential learning. Because if you think about our experiential learning, it's sort of franchising for college students in many ways is what it is. And so that's my advice in terms of like sharing failure, is not just being genuine, authentic of how and why something failed, but what did you learn from it? When something really falls apart and it didn't work, having the humility and the bravery and the intelligence to unpackage it and use it to pivot, that's where the real diamond is.
And the using it to pivot is so critical, and applying the learnings and continuing to improve and just keep that as a constant mindset shift. At where I'm located at M&T Bank, we're going through the efforts to fully scale up agile and just really work in a very iterative, continuous environment and continue to sense and respond, as I call it, to the changes. I think it's phenomenal that everything goes back, as you said earlier, around your mission orientation, and then the actual goals that you were trying to accomplish around experiential learning. And you weren't afraid. You weren't afraid to switch your operating model, how you operate your business, from the franchise model to what it is now. And I think that's pretty powerful. And it sounds like it's part of your model, the continuous learning and applying it and continuing to improve it. So I think that's fantastic. I believe you have a unique title for the students who are running your cafe. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So the students who run our cafes are called student CEOs. It can be chief executive officer. It's actually cafe executive officer. But the idea is, we are teaching people what it's like to be civic-minded leaders, to be 24/7, 365 responsible for not just a business, an operating for-profit business, but to be responsible to a lot of other human beings. We look at ourselves a bit as a workforce development company, and the general definition of workforce development is preparing the next workforce for the modern economy. The modern economy is a little bit different today than it was pre-pandemic. Like technology is just moving at the speed of light, and it is disrupting individual jobs, companies, the way we work, how we work, where we work. Human beings are still so much better at relating to other human beings than technology. And the things that are done better by technology are getting outsourced by the minute. I mean, I feel like on multiple days now, I don't interact with a human being to buy breakfast, to buy groceries, to do any of these kinds of things. Those things are all being outsourced to computers. But what we're looking for human beings to do is what we call them the power skills. Some people used to call them the soft skills. We think that there's nothing soft about them. They're power skills: emotional intelligence, critical thinking, cultural agility. How do you make decisions? Pick yourself up for making the wrong decisions. How do you, cultural agility? How do you work with people that look different than you, that think different than you, have different life experiences than you? Sitting in a classroom, listening to a lecture, being on TikTok all day is not going to teach you those things. You learn them by being on your feet with other human beings. And that's precisely what we're teaching our student leaders through the operation of our experiential learning cafes.
I hear a lot of empathy-based qualities and skills that are needed here to be a student cafe executive officer, if I get that right. I think that's a fantastic title. Sounds incredibly exciting. What would they, how do they feel? How do they feel about doing that monthly P&L conversation? Are they nervous, or do they feel really pumped and excited?
It's funny. I was meeting yesterday. I was with two different university presidents. Talking to them about bringing our experiential learning platform to campus. And I frequently tell this story because I know we're kindred spirits and helping teach and lead young people that, we teach to what we call the three pillars of business: team development, community leadership, and financial management. So team development is, what do you stand for? Who do you attract? How do you hire, train, and empower your people? Secondly, why does your community feel like you matter? Why are they going to support your bank? Why are they going to support your coffee shop? What do you do to make your community better? And third, how do you financially account for all of those different things? And I believe that those matter in that important, that level of importance. It's 1, 2, 3, not 1A, 1B, 1C. It is 1, team development. Your team members have to come first. Because if you're hiring and empowering the right people with the right set of values, you don't have to remind them to take care of the customer. They're already hardwired and now rewarded and empowered to do it. That's where number 2 comes in. And 3 is the financial management. And so you'll probably know this, the punchline to this, but when we interview student CEOs, and I've interviewed every single finalist for student CEO ever, and I hope to continue that for a really, really long time because I love it so much. But we always ask them, they know what the 3 pillars are. They hear a lot about it in the interview process. Many of them work on our teams. What's going to be the hardest for you? They always say financial management. I'm so scared of the P&L. That's going to be so nerve-wracking. And I always laugh to myself that I'm like, little do they know, by far the hardest part of being a leader is team development. There's nothing harder than managing other people.
There you go. I think that's fascinating that, intuitively folks, lean into the P&L as the biggest challenge. And those other two are equally and more important, and if not more difficult to navigate as well. That's fantastic. Where's Saxbys going next? Where's Nick Bayer going next? What do you see in the future? If you had a crystal ball looking in, what does that look like?
This is a really exhilarating time to be a business leader. As we sit here today, I've been doing this now for nearly 15 years. This is the hardest and most challenging labor market we've ever experienced. B, it is the most disrupted supply chain I've ever experienced. And as a result of really those two and some other things, it's the most challenging construction environment as well. So we're growing at about 30%. We're adding 30% to our unit count, essentially a year right now. So we're doing a lot of construction. All three of those things are happening at the exact same time. So it is just a very hectic, challenging time. But you don't become an entrepreneur if you don't like playing contact sports. This is a contact sport. And so I've learned to realize when you have this much headwind, you have to start to look for opportunity to sort of innovate and advance what you're trying to do. And I think for us, we are an experiential learning company, and leveraging, workforce development and education technology are two really, really big areas. And I think that they're really important. It's how do you leverage technology to provide people education? I think an area where very few companies have solved and not enough companies are focusing are how do human beings learn human being skills to become better leaders? And that's what our experiential learning platform is. And it's just something that higher ed does a lot of things well. That is not something they've ever done well. Like not just now they don't do it well. Go back and read How to Win Friends and Influence People. The very beginning of that book, that was written in 1937. Dale Carnegie criticizes higher ed, where he's like, I'm talking to all the magnates of big business in 33, 35, 37 and writing this book. They all talk about how power, essentially what we call power skills, emotional intelligence is the most valued asset of anybody that Vanderbilt employs, that Andrew Carnegie employs. Yet universities don't teach any of those things. 80 years later, they still don't teach those things. And so I think that Saxbys becoming the preeminent experiential learning company is our moonshot. That's what we need to be focused on. And yes, we'll do it through the operation of coffee shops. I think we're going to do it through a lot of other delivery mechanisms as well. And look, I think that as you've touched on it multiple times in this, Aarthi, I think that it is not just great business, because when you can scale with a healthy margin, but every time you're scaling, you're impacting people's lives, you're upskilling them and preparing them for the workforce. That's the level of double impact that the world needs. It needs our greatest companies to be the greatest impactors in a positive way of other human beings. And that's the kind of place where we want to take a leadership position in the years moving forward.
That's fantastic to hear. And I think that's a very clear mission statement for now. And to your point, the moonshot coming up next as well for Saxbys and for Nick. Thank you so much. I thought this was incredibly insightful. You touched on strategy. You talked about, the mission and the vision and really becoming a community entrepreneur. You talked about building your team and your leadership, about successes, lessons, failures, and really building on that and pivoting and not being afraid to do that. And obviously our student CEOs and their experiential learning. And I think it was even more amazing to hear your moonshot and where this is going ahead. So we'll be watching you and Saxbys closely. But thank you so much for your time and look forward to talking to you soon.
It was my absolute pleasure, Aarthi. Thank you so much.